so some background about me. As you can see, I'm just looking to myself. So my name is Ahmad Musa, and my title is in Cloudify as a senior software engineer. And I joined the company back in September 2019. And that was the day I was born with the passion of automating stuff. So I like the quote, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." And I will always welcome being foolish without, it's just good to have some passion. Okay, so let's start. So what is the title of our session? So the session is all about platform engineering using Backstage and Cloudify. Okay, so what is that? You can see here going through a developer requesting a new microservice development environment or whatever, any use case. This is something that we will start to talk about. So let's see how this is actually looks like. So you can see here inside of this slide, I have the developer. I'm requesting a new microservice to deploy. So what I do, I'm a developer. So what I need is just a GitHub repo, right? That's obvious. Then I want a way to deploy my microservice, correct? So what is Cloudify point on this? So you can see we are creating behind the scenes a repo, and we're giving the user two links. And this is something that you can leverage even right now. You can use it, you can test it. It's already described in our official Cloudify videos. It's called developer flow. It was journey. I can share the links after the session. So the idea, I'm creating a new microservice and I want to deploy it. How to make this easy is just, like I said, we're hiding the complexity. So the first thing, the developer, after he's done with the code, he committed all the code, did the testing, did everything, he will click on a link on a Jenkins job, and it will trigger building the images, pushing it to Nexus or Docker Hub. It doesn't matter. That's just as an example. You can model it and customize it as you can see fit. Then we're calling ServiceNow, for example, to check for approval. That's also an optional, right? So optional how? Like I said, this is all a use case. It can be customizable. It's part of our official examples and, So what I do when I get the approval. So the use case is I have an EKS cluster. And inside of this EKS cluster, I want to create a new microservice, new pods, new network. It doesn't matter. So in this case, the use case was EKS with Istio. So you have the Kubernetes cluster. And then you need to create a new microservice. Then whatever else, you can customize it. All right, then we have API gateways. So you can see it's not just a simple build image and create a pod. You can create more stuff. So we said there are lots of components, and what we want to do is to bring order to the chaos, which is what we are here today, right? So Backstage addressed that issue regarding the documentation, but they didn't really like to work on that provisioning side of things. They just wanted to bring the documentation, bring some order, and give you the ability to write your own plugins, right? And do whatever you want. So you can see inside of the default Backstage, you have, for example, CI/CD. You can link it to Jenkins, CI, Work Circle CI, whatever system. This is controlled via the app config and whatever plugin that you want to have as part of your Backstage. Okay, so Cloudify is a plugin. So we have a plugin. It's just an initial version. It doesn't do much because it's an initial version. That's why we have versioning, and we will start showing that. Okay, boring part is over. Let's start with the technical stuff. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the slide here and go, and I'm gonna mirror the screen. I'll stop sharing. All right, this is a familiar interface for all of us developers. So you can see here, I have a local Backstage instance, Cloudify Docker on the top right. I have an interface for me to write code and interact with the CLI, and I have tailing the logs of Cloudify. So I'll show you how this is built. If you have bootstrapped any Backstage instance, it should be easy for you. You clone the repo, you do yarn dev, and it will create two processes, one for the backend and one for the front end. So okay, so the top right is not really important, but if you are doing some more stuff, if there's an exception, it's always good to tail the container logs, but it's optional. So like I said, I have the logs, I have everything. Okay, so this is boring. Let's go to the fun part. All right, so this is Backstage, right? All of us know how does this look like. You register a new component. Okay, what is this component I'm talking about? So I registered a documented component. That's just the name that I, chose. And this is the definition of that YAML file. So let's break it down into pieces. So this is a scaffolding template. And I gave it the name create deployment name. I give it a description. I put the specs. And after that, I started to interact with the user. So what is a blueprint in Cloudify language? Okay, so the blueprint is the syntax that you interact with Cloudify in order to tell it or just describe what do you want Cloudify to do for you. Okay, so all of us are developers here. We know all about development, and we are no strangers to the concept of object-oriented. So let's start. Okay, so a blueprint, you can just call it as a class, and the instance, which is the instantiation of that class, is called a deployment. And you can see here, I have these parameters. I'm providing the name, the ID. I can put all the parameters that is required for me to create a deployment. So let's just take a look back. So this is the Cloudify interface. This is the official UI of Cloudify. So you can see here at the top, on the very left, we have blueprints, which what we just considered as a class, and the deployment can be a service or an environment. In the core of those two things, the services and the environment are both considered as a deployment, but there is a difference because environment can encapsulate different services. They can leverage the capabilities of that deployment. So this is just a simple explanation of what you see here. So this is the blueprint. This is the catalog that I have. You can also create a new service using an existing. So this is the marketplace that we have inside of our official application. So once you bootstrap the image, you will have this marketplace part of your Docker instance. You can see we have integration with different clouds, AWS, Azure, GCP, Terraform, Helm, and it's more than 100 example. So you can see here, for instance, if I go with is AWS and I want the simple one, just to not waste time. So I can just upload it. Once I upload this blueprint, just give it a second. So that the user experience here, you're uploading a resource, and from there, it will give you the option to deploy it. You can choose to cancel it, but it will do the action of uploading that blueprint. Okay, so this is something that, okay, I created the class, and when it's you need a constructor, right? You need to instantiate an object. So these are just like the parameters of the constructor, okay? So please, if you're moving too fast, just stop me. I can explain, okay? Okay, so the blueprint, and I said, this is the, let's take a look at that marketplace, and I'll just describe something in brief. So it's part of the Cloudify community. Inside of Cloudify community, we have the Cloudify catalog. This is what we showed. It's just a representation of what you see now. So inside of AWS, I'll go to the version that I want. So it's 6.4 build. And inside of that structure, if you remember, I went from here. Let's go back for a bit. So this is the dashboard. You can see we're counting how many services, which is deployment. We're also counting how many Kubernetes clusters. This is just the dashboard. So let's go to create a service. So this is AWS. I went with AWS EC2, AWS CFY. So there's so many ways to create an EC2 instance using Cloudify. You can leverage Terraform, right? All of us knows and like ES. So one of the things that you can see here, there is AWS. This is a Cloudify native plugin. So if you go to our documentation, and I suggest you just, because of it's an open source, you can also install it and run a local Docker. So I'm just going to mention this so you would understand the reasoning of this categories. So inside of working with Cloudify, we have the official plugins. And you can see the characterization of those: configuration plugins, infrastructure plugins, orchestration plugins, and the utilities. So for instance, most of the integration that you can do with any system can be a REST or can be a script, shell script, PowerShell, whatever. So we have inside of our rich plugins, for instance, if I go with configuration, we have an Ansible plugin. So we're leveraging the Ansible functionalities. We have built workflows that can just make your life easier. So you want, for example, reload, rerun that Ansible. We all know that Ansible is just stateless, and Terraform is the other way around. It's stateful. So it is holding the state file inside of the properties. And we all know the pain of, managing Terraform is not that simple. There's lots of drifts. Somebody can go and modify the resources on the cloud directly. Lots of mess. So Cloudify and Backstage working together can bring some order. Cloudify will focus on the provisioning and keeping track of resources, the actual stuff, and Backstage can present those in a friendly way using the developer portal. So inside of this configuration, I said we have infrastructure plugins, and this infrastructure plugins, you can see we're supporting most of the public clouds. We have AWS, we have Azure, GCP, vSphere, and all of these are customizable. It's open source. You can have it, you can clone it, you can extend it. It's Python code. If you know Python, it should be straightforward for you. And there's also the documentation of how you write your own plugin. So you can see here we have a developer guide. Inside of the developer reference, you can write in plugins. And we have a reference and everything. So one more thing that I want to say is inside of Cloudify Cosmo, which is the official organization on GitHub. Okay, so let's open up the template. So writing a plugin is very simple because it's well documented right now. So you can see, for instance, here inside of the plugin YAML. So in Cloudify, it's YAML based. It's using a Tosca definition. So this is how you define a plugin. You start from the plugins, you give it a name, which will be used later. And you can see everything is documented and well documented with examples. You define your data types, DSL definitions, and everything. And this is actually working. You can just clone it and build it, and it will work out of the box. So what this actually does, you define the YAML structure, how it will receive the data, and what is important for you. Okay, so I modeled the data. I got my parameters, and I want to do something with it, right? So this is where the lifecycle operations comes in. And when we go to create, so plugin template, and inside of the plugin, so just to let you know how I'm tracking this. So inside of the plugin YAML, you can see here we have the package name, right? So once you get the package name, you will go to the setup.py. Then it will become just a Python, ordinary Python, structure. So you give it here inside of the setup. You have the name. So this will be a package inside of the virtual environment. Then you're always going to be interacting with this part. Inside of the plugin template, you go to plugin. Inside of the plugin, you have the structure of any Python package, right? So we have these tasks. And like I said, it's very well documented, I believe so. But you can see, you can get the properties, you can play with them. Yeah, so that's the incentive of creating any plugin. So like I said, Cloudify is agnostic. You can create your own plugins. You can interact with them. You can build any logic that you want. Okay? All right, so that's about the reasoning behind having those inside of the catalog. So we have AWS, pure AWS. It's leveraging Boto3 library. We have Azure directly from Azure SDK. We have the GCP. It's using the official Python packages. And we also have, for example, the Terraform, which is a wrapper against the Go library. It's a Go CLI of Terraform. So, Terraform initialize, Terraform star, apply, whatever. So Cloudify just built a component, a node type that will just do all the logic. If you're not familiar with anything about Terraform, you should be able to do it very, very fast and simple. Because Cloudify offers something cool. I'll show it to you in a sec. So I'm going to my catalog. This is my catalog. So Cloudify offers here from upload. There is upload from marketplace, which is the page that we were on. And we have upload from Terraform module. So what does this mean? What do you mean upload from a Terraform module? Yeah, it means what it sounds. I can give it the Terraform module and it will on the fly create for me at the template. So let me give this a name. So I'll call this blueprint DevOps days. And inside of it, I can select which Terraform version that I want to have as a binary, because you can have different binary versions, right? So for example, I'll go with the default and I can give it a URL. So what will happen now? I give it a zip file, which is an archive, and it will parse it and it will go through the modules. What I mean by modules, we can open that GitHub repo and take a look at it. Let's go with no. So you can see here we have the Terraform module. So if I open this link, which is part of the community as well. So if we go to Cloudify community, and I go to TF source, which is Terraform source, the structure of the template is the following. So inside of the template, we have the main.tf, and inside of it, we have different modules. So you can see Azure public VM, GCP public VM, IBM, Cloudify, right? So if I go back to Cloudify wrapper, I can see all of those modules. If I select any of them, for example, if I go with public VM, which is an EC2 instance on a public network, what will happen? It will just parse it and tell me there is 9 variables on one input. So how did it do that? So I go to modules. Inside of the modules, we have a public VM. And inside of the main and the variables that we were defined. So one of them is just one output, which is the IP. And the other stuff is defined inside of the variables. So all of us know, those who doesn't know Terraform, this is very, very simple. It's just one Terraform module that just creates the VPC. So you create the variables, and inside of your public VM, you just go to the main. This is your starting point. So you define the credentials of your AWS. You put the access and the region, the access ID, and the secret ID. You can see it's just leveraging the official VPC module from AWS. Then there is the image. It's sent to us base. And this is the example of creating the example VM. You can see the instance type is here. You can modify it, of course. You can make it as a variable. And then you can see creating other resources. So let me ask you a question. What do you want to create a fully functional EC2 instance with access? Can you answer that, please? What do you think? What do you need to make an EC2 instance available? Or let me rephrase myself. You're working with AWS, right? So what do you need in order to have a fully functional EC2 instance? It's not just an instance. You need to have a networking, right? So let's take a step back. In order to have a fully functional instance, you need to have the VPC, the subnet, the networking, right? So that's basic stuff if you're using AWS console. But Terraform came and fixed that problem using the providers, using the functions. So you can see here all the resources that is needed to create a fully functional EC2 instance. For example, Elastic IP, whatever, the instance itself, the VPC, everything is controlled and handled by Terraform, which is the powerful way of Terraform bringing to the table. So Cloudify created this wrapper, and we're expecting to have also a Helm wrapper because it's basically the same concept as Terraform, right? So let's go with yes. If I hit yes, we saw inside of the source code. So Cloudify automatically gave you a list of all of the variables that you defined inside of your module. You can specify and play with the type. So it can be a user input. So again, Blueprint itself, if you read about it in the documentation, it has an input section, the description of what Cloudify will do, we call it node templates, and outputs and capabilities. So you can see here, the variable section, after detecting it, it will give you the ability to make it part of something that you ask the user when you create a blueprint, or it's a static value, or from the secret, and all of that is just configured. So let me just cancel because it's already here. I'm using it, it's the same thing. Okay, so this is about Cloudify. So for instance, if I want to deploy the flow from Cloudify, if I want to deploy a blueprint, I give it a name. So you can see here, I'm just filling in the details. These are the input section. So this is actually rendered as a list because inside of the YAML, we can take a look at it. So I just create an install. It will create a deployment, trigger the execution of install. Okay, so what Cloudify is showing right now, we have last execution, deployment info, and history. So let me just show you the YAML file of this deployment. So this is how Cloudify is just defining stuff. So we have the Tosca DSL version, which means what type of functions and capabilities we are supporting on this YAML Cloudify version. And inside of it, we have the input section, like I said, where you define the inputs that you want the user to provide. You can have default values, you can have description, you can have constraints. All of that is just possible. So we're good with that front. We created a deployment. You can have intrinsic function. The intrinsic function, for example, you can do string find, string replace, concat. All of this is part of the documentation. So if you go to Cloudify docs, you can see the writing of the, okay, so working with Cloudify. There is a whole section describing that user inputs, blueprints inputs, and all of that stuff. So inside of best practices, I guess, yeah. So you can see here, there's a page that describes this best. I'm not gonna waste time on this because we only have, I think, 10 minutes or so. Okay. Okay, so you can see this is the starting point because this is just a mocked blueprint, doesn't do anything. But let's take a look at the deployment of an actual resource. So this is the blueprint, okay? So you can see here, Cloudify parsed that YAML file and showed you the structure of the node templates that you have. So you can see here we have the VPC, we have the route table, the subnet. All of these components are needed to have a fully functional EC2 instance. Okay, so let's take a look at the code of this. So this is the blueprint YAML. It's part of the catalog, so I told you can just use it. So it's using our official AWS plugin. This is just the definition of the components from. Sure. So the inputs are just having default values. You can have constraint. You can have instance types, all that stuff. So the starting point of each execution is from this point. So just like in Python or any other language, you should have an entry point. The main entry or the main code starts from here. So inside of the node templates, you can see we're creating an agent key, which is the private and public key. And then we have the cloud init to do some stuff on the bootstrapping of that machine. We have the VM, so the VPC, sorry. And then we have the internet gateway. And notice something here, something interesting. Relationships. Okay. Relationships is the way you control the flow. And we will get to that when I create a new deployment of this. So the VPC itself, it will just create a VPC on AWS. Then the internet gateway, all that stuff that is required. Okay, the subnet. We have the IP, the NIC, the security rules. All that stuff that is required for you to have a fully functional VM. So it's not just click on the console and give it, I want an instance. That doesn't go like this in cloud, right? There's lots of stuff that is in the background that you don't account for because they just try to hide the complexity. So let's create a deployment. So this is from Cloudify. Let's call it, for example, test Cloudify. Okay. So let's hit install. So now, so we have the create deployment completed. We can take a look at the history. And this is a good thing, right? So to have a visual representation of the execution graph, so we said we used relationships, right, to control the flow of the execution. So you can't really create the instance without having the VPC. You can't create, for example, the instance without having the NIC. So here you can see the flow and the execution status of each operation. So we have stuff turning into green, which means it's a success without any issues. We have stuff that's already being handled. Okay, so This is all good and fun. This is Cloudify thing. Let's take a look at Backstage. Okay, so I'm gonna request a deployment from Backstage. So like I said, this is the scaffolding template that I used. I defined the parameters, the properties. So for instance, I can make this more dynamic. It can be Ginger rendered. For example, we're working on making this, so it's still under development, but it can be rendered via a script that just parses your Cloudify and building this whole big Cloudify create deployment. And yeah, lots of stuff still under discussion, but yeah, there is a way to make it more dynamic. Right now, I put some static values. It can be rendered via Jinja, so you can put a Jinja here that parses whatever you have in Cloudify, and it can be via a recurring workflow in Cloudify to update it on GitHub. In the end, this is hosted on GitHub, so it's importing that template YAML. Right? So now I'm going to this documented deployment, and this is something that we all know about Backstage, right? This is the default thing. Notice something interesting here. We have a Cloudify, right? At the very top. Let's edit. Okay, so what it is doing right now, it's loading. So loading what? Right now it's pulling all the blueprints that you have inside of your manager that you defined inside of the app config. Okay, so I have 2 blueprints. Let's validate that. Okay, this is inside my tenant. Yo, I have 2 blueprints, right? So it's reading live. Okay. Okay, next. I want to upload a new blueprint. There is a way to do it. Why not just do it? All right. All right. Let's see what happens. What is happening behind the scenes? All right. It's being parsed. It's live. It's reading from the upload via REST integration. It's calling the upload blueprint API, and we have blueprint upload finished successfully. All right, that's not enough. Let's go back. Right, again, it should parse. So you can see now it's rendered part of the table, right? And we have the description, we have the icons, and everything is good. All right, that sounds interesting. Let's create a deployment. I'm gonna test Backstage. And I can select that blueprint that creates an EC2 instance on AWS, and I'll hit create. Cool. Let's see what will happen now. All right. So we have some details. Nice. So we have the deployment name, the deployment ID, blueprint ID, tenant name, and installation status. Okay, it's inactive. What does that mean? That means it's not finished yet. We can track the executions, right? So we have the progress. Creating the deployment is terminated. Install is still running. This is the progress. I can confirm that going back to Cloudify. You can see the test Backstage. So like I said, this is the execution graph. It's not finished yet. They can confirm in the history that create deployment is finished. And the progress. Okay, let's take a look at the execution detail. All right, so we have the deployment execution details, and it's still started. All right, we have the logs as well. CI/CD format. This is also part of the stage, so we can take a look at the execution. We can have the logs. So it's the same thing, but in something unified in Backstage language. All right, we're all good here? Okay. Okay, let's go back to the deployment. What else I can do? Let's see. All right, so I have the access to see the inputs that the user passed. I can take a look at the labels that's on this deployment. I can take a look at the deployment and capabilities. So this is actually an instance. I can connect to it. So you can see the IP is just a public IP. So if I just copy this, and let's create another shell session. I can copy the IP. And let's try to log into it. Let's see, it's active now. All right. Copied some white spaces. Let me just clear that up. Okay, interesting. Okay, that means that we have a problem. So how would I diagnose that? I need the logs, right? That's why inside of the execution, I can go and see if it's finished or not. This is where the important thing that happens. Okay, so now a DevOps guy who knows AWS and responsible about this should take a look. It's finished, everything is okay, so why can't I access it? There's lots of reasons for that, right? For example, security group, missing security group. So what else? Somebody knows. Who's that? The DevOps or the cloud engineer, right? So he have the access to see all the logs and he understands what he sees. That's the whole idea of Backstage. I have a deployment, I have the logs. So what I do, I go to the execution details. Okay, what happened here? Okay, the VPC ID is none. Okay. So when a Cloudify engineer or a cloud engineer sees this logs here in one place, he can take a decision to do what needs to be done. So you can see here, we created the VPC, we created everything, post chart. I want to see what happened, right? So that's how the CI/CD comes in, and then let's see. Right, so the installation status is okay. We can consult with AWS. Let's see what happened. So I'm gonna log into AWS and see what is happening. Now I'm just putting the hat of the cloud engineer. I have the AWS. I want to have access to this AWS, and then I can also work with the second factor authentication. Yeah, we're done. All right. So, oh, sorry, I didn't. I'm done. It's done. I'm just doing some more stuff. So it was done. All right. Thank you guys for attending. It was a pleasure to be here, and thanks. I hope this was, informative and you can leverage it. And, we will hope to see a better version of this. Of course, one hand doesn't clap, so you always do the calibration. All right. Have a good one and have a good rest of the event.